Our next topic is the history of education. We could simply read a textbook-like synopsis of this history, but I think it'll be more beneficial to engage with this topic in a more substantive way. Therefore, we'll be looking at this topic through the lens of critical race theory, also known as CRT. There are many ideas within CRT, but we will be focusing only on one of those ideas, the concept of interest convergence. The term interest convergence was coined in 1995 by Derek Bell, a CRT and legal scholar. More recently, Gloria Ladson-Billings in 2013, who's also a CRT scholar but from the education perspective, summarized this idea saying, quote, "White people will seek racial justice only to the extent that there is something in it for them." In other words, progress for African Americans or other marginalized groups is only made possible or achieved when the interests or goals of those marginalized groups are aligned with the interests or goals of the dominant group, often white men. Here's a short clip of Gloria Ladson-Billings talking about interest convergence when it comes to policies around diversity today.
Another tenet of critical race theory is Derek Bell's conception of interest convergence. Interest convergence suggests that civil rights legislation only passes when it produces benefits for the dominant culture. So if you take the case of affirmative action, most whites see it as a program to solely benefit people of color. But the numbers tell us something different. According to the United States Department of Labor, white women are the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action because there's more of them, right? And we never seem to talk about this. But consider this. The majority of white women live with other white people, men, women, and children. So the benefits of affirmative action flow through the white community. Thus, the interests of blacks and Latinos and American Indians for access to good jobs and good schools converge with those of whites to make sure that they too can access those jobs and those schools. I think another example of interest convergence occurred years ago in Arizona when their former governor, Evan Mecham, declared that his state would not observe the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday because it was too expensive. He said it would cost too much money to provide another paid holiday for state employees. Immediately, the African American community responded by indicating that they would not choose Arizona as a destination for vacations or conferences or recreation. And specifically, the National Basketball Association declared it would not hold its All-Star game in the state. After that pronouncement, Governor Mecham reversed himself. Now, I don't believe that he had a change of heart regarding Dr. King or the holiday. Rather, the economic interests of the governor converged with those of African Americans and others who were supporting the King holiday to create this, quote, interest convergence.
It would certainly be wonderful if the creation and expansion of education in the United States was only done for entirely altruistic and selfless reasons, but that's sadly not always the case. So, we will use this idea to help us see when the interests of those in power ultimately benefited by creating or expanding education to marginalized groups. The issue at stake may be increasing access to schools or school resources or expanding access to who can become a teacher. When investigating the history of education in America, it's important to note that authors will not directly say, "This is an example of interest convergence." Instead, we have to read between the lines to identify examples of interest convergence. We might find examples where progress was made because the interest of the marginalized group aligned with the interests of the dominant group. And we might find examples where progress was not made because the interests of the marginalized group were not aligned with the interests of the dominant group. Both are good examples for understanding interest convergence. Let's take a look at an example from colonial Massachusetts. Here's a short reading passage for us to analyze. Colonial Massachusetts was among the very first places in the world to make the education of young people a public responsibility. The English Puritans who settled Boston in 1630 believed that children's welfare on earth and in the afterlife depended in large part on their ability to read and understand the Bible. The success of the colony also rested on literate citizenry. Men should be able to read and understand the laws governing them. The founders of Massachusetts Bay recognized that next generation would need leaders who were learned in theology, philosophy, and government. For both religious and political reasons, then, the Puritans began almost immediately to establish schools. So, from this passage, we know that politicians and clergymen in colonial Massachusetts were interested in establishing and maintaining a stable government, as well as ensuring that their community members remained faithful churchgoers. These interests led them to support policies for educating children to read and write. So, the interests of children in terms of having an increased access to education are aligned with those interests of the dominant group in colonial Massachusetts. Therefore, progress is made in the form of increased literacy among many children in colonial Massachusetts. Let's consider for a moment, though, which marginalized groups might not have progressed towards equitable access to education in this time and place. Based on their interests, do you think that the colonial politicians and clergymen would have supported increased education among local Native American tribes? What about non-Christian children? Probably not. These are potential examples where the interests of a marginalized group would not be aligned with the interests of the dominant group, and therefore result in no progress. To conclude, when we are analyzing a resource about the history of education, we will want to ask ourselves, who benefits from this particular expansion of education? Is it just the marginalized group these rights are being extended to, such as African Americans, women, or recent immigrants? Or will businesses, political leaders, or other wealthy or powerful individuals also benefit when rights to public education are expanded? Maybe by identifying instances of interest convergence in the past, we can better prepare to extend rights and access to people in the present and future without having to ask, what's in it for those in power?